now that we have heard some theological perspectives, we will turn to a religious education perspective, and I would like to focus on religious education at school. I have structured my presentation as follows. Yes, you can see it. In federal organized Germany, there is a plethora of different models of religious education in the state schools. The most widespread model is denominational religious education, which is regulated by the Basic Law. According to the Basic Law, this denominational religious education is an ordinary subject taught in accordance with the principles of the religious communities. This means that there is not only Protestant and Catholic religious education, but also Islamic, Jewish, Orthodox, Alevi, and others. From a scientifically oriented Islamic religious education perspective, which is aligned with the findings of modern pedagogy, children and adolescents are seen as productively processors of reality, which draws on Klaus Horelmann's theory of the productive processing of reality. This means that they also have an active role in processing and shaping social reality. They are co-constructors of reality. Not only do adults have the ability to reflect on religious issues, but also children are already thinking about religious topics and developing their own, albeit still childishly formulated, theories. According to Miriam Zimmermann and Friedrich Schweitzer, these theories can be described and understood both as reflection on religion and as theology. Furthermore, it is crucial for religious education to provide lessons which are meaningful for the lives of children and adolescents. This can only succeed if the content is developed in such a way that it is linked to the student's world and experience and life, and constitutively takes into account their own ways of understanding and interpreting. This requires empirical research on religious socialization, religious attitudes, and beliefs. The focus on children and adolescents with their own developmental needs and needs for orientation, as well as access to the world, must never be lost. The view of children and adolescents is characterized by a constructivistic perspective. Learning never happens in such a way that certain insights are simply transferred from adults to children. Learning always takes place only in the form of the interpretations developed by the children themselves as their own constructions of world and reality. This is also and especially the case in the religious field. Religious education that does not take this into account fails the children. For Germany and many other countries in Central Europe, a change can be observed in which the traditional Christian imprint of the majority of the population is increasingly giving way to religious and worldview diversity. Against the background of migration and globalization, the challenges and opportunities for interreligious learning have already been discussed for about 25 years in religious education. Although the urgency of interreligious learning has gradually become apparent in politics and academia, there is still too little scientific clarification of, quote, what conclusions are to be drawn from this and how such learning can be successfully organized, quote, Friedrich Schweitzer. Quote end, yes. There are conceptual considerations of a theoretical nature in the discussion of religious education. In the Christian field, various models of theology of religion have been developed to relate the truth claims of one's own religion to the truth claims of other religions. Exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism, you know all of them. And however, there are still few studies that empirically examine religious attitudes towards other religions and their adherents. Such empirical research is of crucial importance, especially for the conceptual considerations of interreligious learning. The aim is to clarify the initial conditions for interreligious learning processes and to provide impulses for theological considerations. Based on the preliminary results of a study I conducted with Muslim youths, I would like to outline some findings about how school students who see themselves as Muslim view their Christian peers. From the findings, I will derive some questions for Islamic Comparative Theology. I don't have any answers, and so I am very curious about your reactions and impressions, and also the response of my colleague Jan. My work does not intend to reconstruct what young people who see themselves as Muslim say about externally predefined Christians. But it tries to bring to light how these young people conceptualize and construct the term Christian and which connections to their self-constructions become visible. The research presented here draws on the relevance of the young people and makes this the starting point for considerations regarding interreligious teaching and learning processes. So far, 2 group discussions have been conducted with 10th grade students from a gymnasium in a medium-sized German town. The participants were 4 girls and 3 boys. 1 girl's family belonged to the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat. In both group discussions, the opening stimulus asked for experiences with Christians. The term Christian was used as an empty term that the interviewed young people were asked to fill with meaning in the course of the discussion. Whenever terms as Christians or Christian appear in the interview passages, they are interpreted as a construction by the interviewees. The empirical analysis of dense passages from both group interviews so far shows that the interviewees find themselves in a field of tension, which is determined on the one hand by the diverse cultural landscapes of the German majority society in which they were born and grew up, and on the other hand by the equal diverse cultural landscapes of their families and communities. The young people are faced with the biographical task of relating these 2 factors to each other and thus constructing a third, a kind of synthesis with their own way of life. This framework determines their speech and their issues. And it is within this framework that their statements about Christians must be interpreted. The quotations I will read out and show you in the following are intended to vividly illustrate my interpretations. Of course, my interpretations are based on considerably more data, which I have been able to reconstruct to various interpretative steps. Religion and faith are of interest to the interviewees. On the one hand, because of the religiously diverse affiliations of their fellow pupils, and on the other hand, because of those peers who describe themselves as atheists. In particular, the focus is on belief or non-belief in God. The interviewers strongly associate the term Christian with their mostly non-Muslim schoolmates. It is noticeable that the impulse Christians triggers a discussion among the interviewed youth about an impression that is described as follows. Billa says, "It feels like they are not as religious as other religions anymore." Billa, like the other group members, has the impression that the habitualized daily religious practice of the majority of his friends, who he calls Christians, is much weaker than that of himself. However, the Christians are also perceived to have less knowledge and less willingness to identify with religion, as Rania says. So for me, somehow, I usually see that Christians don't have that much knowledge about their religion. As far as religious knowledge is concerned, a negative counter-horizon to one's own knowledge is created. Rania says, of course, not all of them and not all Christians are so uninformed about it, but in the general picture, I think you can see that more Muslim than Christian youth identify with their religion and are also engaged with it. Despite this self-attributed knowledge advantage, the interviews hold back in conversation with the Christians about deeper religious topics. Eileen says, when we sit together, we also talk to Christians, if only about the biggest things like why do you believe in God, but we don't go any further, so we are not yet ready to discuss the whole thing with them properly, and that's why we usually hold back a bit on the bigger issues. The lower identification with religion mentioned by the interviewers is justified by the fact that religion does not concern the constructed Christians in their everyday life, or that they have no interest in it. At the same time, however, the argument was brought up that the parents of the Christians allow their children greater freedom of choice when it comes to religion. Hannah says, and despite the fact that their parents are Christian, it is also interesting that they decide to stay away from a religion and then decide for atheism. And Rania says, the parents give them so much freedom, like live your life and get to know the religion yourself and then decide for yourself. In doing so, the interviewees construct an interesting contrast between being religious and being free. Bilal says, the Christians don't want to be so religious. They don't have the will to live religiously, so to speak. They want to be free. Being free on the one hand and being religious on the other hand are constructed by the interviewees as opposites. The pedagogical freedom that parents grant Christian youth is seen as the reason why Christian youth are able to separate the religious views of their family and culture from their individual views, both in their thinking and in their everyday practice. For the Christian youths, in the view of the interviewees, there is no conflict between the Christianity of their parents and their Christian environment and their individual decisions to keep away from what the Muslim youth consider to be Christian religion. Another tension is revealed in the interviewers' statements about the interpretations of their own religion and culture by the majority society and the resulting pressure to justify themselves, which puts the young people in an apologetic position, something of which they are aware. Rania says, yes, maybe it can also be that Muslims are more concerned with their religion, that nowadays Islam is everywhere in the media, and then one automatically has this need to justify oneself. In the view of the interviewees, it is typical for the Christians that they do not make the negative aspects of their own religion an issue. In the example cited and in other quotations, this is experienced as asymmetrical and unfair towards the Muslims. Despite having many instances of experiencing difference, the interviewees perceive themselves and others as normal humans, i.e. basically very similar. The only thing that is perhaps somehow different is that with the mosques and the churches, one sometimes wishes that there was adhan out loud. Adhan means the call to prayer. Some of them would like to be able to show their religion in public without getting strange stares. However, the young people would also understand the alienation of Christians if they were forced to hear the call for prayer every day. For example, Rania says, I would also understand if it annoyed Christians. Here, as in many other places, the young people consider what it would mean for Christians if they were in the same situation as the interviewees themselves. In both group interviews, they repeatedly adopt the perspective of the Christians they construct. Thus, it becomes clear in both interviews that the young people always want to build bridges between the worlds in which they live. Both group discussions show that their religion has a significant value for the interviewees. It is primarily the elements of Muslim orthopraxy that they live that distinguishes them as Muslim from the Christians. Bilal says, we were in the middle of gambling, and then I said, yes, I have to go to Friday prayers, and then someone asked me, what do you do there? However, the interviewees do not see their own religious practice as the problem in these statements, but rather their plausibility, as one of them expresses. But I do understand why outsiders perceive this perhaps also as oppression or such like these things. For example, you have to pray and go to the mosque. For me, it was just like that from childhood onwards. I have always seen this from my parents and my grandparents, and it has also somehow become routine. And so it is no longer as awkward as some say, praying 5 times a day, if you say it like that. However, they do not see their own religion in a completely positive light either. The interviewees also think critically about aspects of their own religion. As Bilal says, so I am a Muslim, but there are also things where, for example, I question things. There are also rituals where I ask myself, why? And I don't know, I once said it would make more sense if one updated the Quran. Because the more time goes by, the harder it gets. Many things are just so vaguely described. Despite the lesser religiosity that the interviewees perceive in the Christians they construct, the Christians also show an openness to the youth and the elements of their everyday religious practice. Bilal said, what I notice is that in Germany, especially the younger generation of Christians, some of them take it more casually and also have fun with religion. And, for example, terms like mashallah, inshallah, and so on have almost become normal terms even for Christians. And yes, that's why I also noticed that Christians talk a bit like us with the terms, and yes, they are more relaxed. Okay. Based on the contrasting analysis of 2 group interviews conducted so far, the question of how young people who see themselves as Muslims socially construct Christians relative to the construction of their respective selves was explored. First of all, what constitutes Christians is strongly linked to the practice of one's own peer group, which forms an attractive, but not in every respect, unproblematic counter-horizon to the lives of those interviewed. The interviewed youths interpret their observations in such a way that religion in the lives of their non-Muslim peers has a much lowered everyday significance, and the relationship of the young Christians to religious phenomena is generally much more relaxed than the interviewees perceive in themselves. A key difference between the constructed Christians and the young people who see themselves as Muslim is made on the issue of being free versus being religious. The Christians are constructed as those who have the freedom to choose between the religious beliefs of their families and their individual beliefs. Religious practices, which are very important in the everyday life of the interviewees, have neither relevance nor consequences for the constructed Christians. The young people interviewed counter this with an added value of their own religiosity, which they each describe differently. They admit that they may seem unfree at first glance, but nevertheless do not want to do without this added value of their religion. Beyond the narrow cycle of their peers, what constitutes Christian is also defined by various practices of the majority society, which also forms an ambivalent counter-horizon to that of the interviewees. In this context, the young people report experiences of foreignness, but also of respect and belonging. As soon as the issue of the term Christian is extended beyond the narrow cycle of their peers and families, an equation of Christian and Occidental increasingly shimmers through. However, some interview partners also use the word German both to describe others and to describe themselves. With regard to comparative theology, preliminary results show that the young people who see themselves as Muslim think comparatively to a certain extent when they construct Christians, i.e. when they can include the religious otherness of the constructed Christians in their own theological thinking. Only on the basis of their own religious inner perspectives are they able to construct the Christians at all. In their construction of Christians, the youth interviewed are careful to not make gross generalizations. They try to describe their experiences with Christians in a differentiated way. They try to balance what they see as contradictory aspects, knowing that they cannot resolve them or can do so only with difficulty. The interviewees themselves do not want to be essentialized, ethnicized, or culturalized, and avoid this when constructing Christians. Both interviewed groups demonstrate a high tolerance of ambiguity and a positive approach to diversity. They often adopt the perspective of the constructed Christians, but also perceive their ability to adopt perspectives in their Christian peers, at least in part. The interviewees are able to perceive the otherness of others and try to understand it. Their expressions show both a differentiation from the way the constructed Christians deal with their religious tradition and an appreciation of them. In some cases, it is also clear that the interviewees are trying to understand their own religious tradition in a new way by comparing religious traditions. In addition, they partly relativize their own religious tradition by trying to explain it rationally, even if in an apologetical way. But a critical position towards their own tradition also becomes apparent. In a paradigmatic way, the construction of the other takes place in the construction of the own. It becomes clear that the young people become more aware of the ambivalent meaning and effectiveness of their own tradition when they deal with the non-Muslim other. Based on the interviews and the results described, I would like to formulate some questions that should provide impulses for defining Islamic comparative theology from my religious education perspective. Admittedly, these two group interviews are not sufficient to be able to draw generally applicable conclusions. They do, however, draw attention to some aspects and problems that an Islamic comparative theology must face. The following ambivalence lies in the construction of Christians on the basis of the young people's own ideas about Islam. On the one hand, one's own is always the 0 point or calibration point from which the other is understood. On the other hand, it is not only a position taken in religious education that the other religion can only be understood from within itself, if one aims to do justice to it. Where does an Islamic comparative theology position itself in this paradoxical field of tension? The young people interviewed experience differences related to the migration and minority situation, as well as language, ethnicity, nationality, and gender. This is usually not the case with young people from the majority society. However, they cannot be left out of the interreligious learning context. What role do such experiences play in comparative theology when it undertakes to, quote, first expose oneself to the otherness of others and seek to understand it in order to then arrive at judgment on this basis, and not a priori before the interreligious encounter. Quote end, this was a quote from Klaus, and vice versa. What does a comparative theology look like that is formulated from the perspective of a migration and minority situation in relation to the predominant religion of the majority society? Klaus von Stosch writes, quote, all representatives of comparative theology agree that comparative theology is about theology, and thus about normative questions about ultimate reality. Comparative theology, like all theology, thus search for God, quote end. It becomes clear among the young people that a central question in the mental debate with the constructed Christians and atheists is the question of belief or not belief in God. But equally important are questions such as religious freedom, individual self-determination, pressure to justify oneself to the family and the environment, prejudices, doubts, etc. How does an Islamic comparative theology deal with these questions? The question of God does not exist in a vacuum. It is in the midst of the lives of individuals and in how they deal with the constraints and freedoms of their religion and their social environment. Some of the interviewees begin to question their own beliefs in the construction of Christians and their religious traditions. An open encounter cannot limit in advance the learning processes that like place in it. If it does, it is not an open encounter. How does an Islamic comparative theology deal with learning from the religious other? And how willing is it to face the inevitable uncertainty that a serious opening necessarily entails? The openness of the interviews owes much to a method and a theoretical approach that takes the statements of both young people and non-theologically educated adults seriously as valid theological statements. Comparative theology, like all theology, stands in the context and within the demands of its own tradition. Is an Islamic comparative theology willing and able to take the theological competence of people like these youths seriously and be challenged by it? Thank you for your attention.